The year is 1903 CE, and the Roman system has completely collapsed. Following the assassination of Emperor Commodus, the elite Praetorian Guard murders his successor, and then literally auctions off the imperial throne to the highest bidder in a torchlit courtyard. The man who would end this circus held no traditional pedigree. Septimius Severus was born in North Africa, far from the established Roman aristocracy, but he possessed the ultimate bargaining chip: absolute command over the battle-hardened legions stationed along the Danube frontier. Disgusted by the brazen corruption in the capital, Severus mobilized his troops. He bypassed the Senate entirely, marching straight on Rome with a strict determination to impose order through overwhelming force. Knowing he couldn't fight on two fronts, Severus made a calculated political maneuver. He sent envoys to his main rival in Britain, Claudius Albinus, granting him the junior title of Caesar to temporarily pacify him and protect the rear of the advancing Danubian army. Severus recognized that the polite political negotiations of the past were dead. To rescue the empire from immediate ruin, he dropped the facade of diplomacy entirely and forged a state ruled openly by the sword. The moment Severus entered Rome, he summoned the treacherous Praetorian Guard. Instead of rewarding them, he stripped them of their ceremonial armor, banished them from the city, and filled their vacant ranks entirely with his own loyal, battle-tested frontier soldiers. With the capital secured, he turned his war machine outward to hunt down the remaining claimants to the throne. He marched east to crush Pessinus Niger in Syria, and then pivoted west to finally deal with Claudius Albinus. The scale of this Roman-on-Roman violence was massive. The conflict climaxed in Gaul at the brutal Battle of Lugdunum, where Severus deployed roughly 75,000 men to slaughter Albinus's forces and cement his absolute control. Upon returning to Rome, Severus turned his attention to the politicians who had backed his rivals. He purged the Senate, executing nearly 30 of its members on charges of treason, to make it clear that military supremacy, not senatorial decree, was the sole basis of his rule. For 2 centuries, emperors had maintained the Principate, a pleasant political fiction that they shared power equally with the Senate. Severus killed that illusion, openly embracing the reality of a harsh military dictatorship. With his internal rivals dead, Severus focused his new military state outward. As we see on this map of the empire, he launched 3 massive expansion campaigns, pushing the borders into Parthia in the east, deep into Africa in the south, and up to the northern edges of Britain. Following this advance into the east, his legions pushed across the Euphrates River into Parthian territory. They sacked the royal capital of Ctesiphon, seized its immense wealth, and permanently annexed northern Mesopotamia into the Roman fold. In the south, he secured the Sahara frontier against desert nomads, bringing lucrative new trade routes into the empire. He funneled much of that wealth directly into his hometown of Leptis Magna, transforming the provincial port with sweeping new forums and lavish marble monuments. His final campaign took him to the freezing, unforgiving highlands of Caledonia, modern-day Scotland. Despite being severely ill, Severus led 50,000 men in a grinding guerrilla war against local tribes, extensively rebuilding the stone defenses of Hadrian's Wall along the way. These relentless campaigns pushed the Roman Empire to its greatest geographical extent in history. However, permanently garrisoning these distant, hostile borders required an immense amount of manpower, stretching the imperial supply lines and treasury to their absolute limits. Back in the capital, the imperial court was undergoing its own transformation under Empress Julia Domna. A powerful Syrian noblewoman, she actively shaped state policy and surrounded herself with an inner circle of philosophers, physicians, and rhetoricians that brought a cultural renaissance to Rome. But that high-minded intellectual culture stood in stark contrast to the reality of her 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta. The designated heirs to the empire harbored a deep, violent hatred for one another, constantly plotting and squabbling within the palace walls. Desperate to forge some kind of unity between them, Severus dragged both sons away from the comforts of Rome. He brought them to the freezing front lines of the British campaign, hoping the harsh realities of military administration would force them to cooperate. It didn't work. The man who could violently enforce order across the entire known world, from the deserts of Syria to the bogs of Scotland, was completely powerless to stop his own family from tearing itself apart. By 211 CE, the grueling conditions of the British campaign finally caught up with the aging emperor, breaking his iron constitution. Severus lay dying in a freezing military camp at Eboracum, the site of modern-day York. As his health failed, he summoned his two feuding sons to his bedside and delivered his final cynical philosophy of rule: be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others. That advice failed almost immediately. Less than a year after taking power, the harmony Severus demanded dissolved completely when Caracalla had his brother Geta assassinated, murdering him while he clung to their mother's arms. The rest of the deathbed maxim laid bare the fatal flaw of the Severan system. By stripping away civic authority and relying exclusively on the loyalty of the army, Severus rendered every other Roman institution meaningless. The directive to enrich the soldiers carried a staggering economic cost. Severus had already expanded the size of the army and drastically increased their annual pay, creating a military budget that the traditional tax base simply could not support. To finance this massive expenditure, he resorted to a dangerous fiscal trick behind the locked doors of the imperial mint. He drastically debased the currency, reducing the physical sculpture purity of the standard Roman denarius. This chart visualizes the immediate fallout. As the silver content of the Roman coin plummets on this descending line, we see a violently spiking secondary line representing rampant inflation, which quickly wiped out the purchasing power of the average Roman citizen. The economic damage was paired with an even deadlier political precedent. Because Severus proved that the throne belonged to whoever paid the army best, this rising bar graph shows how future emperors became trapped, forced to constantly buy the loyalty of mutinous legions just to survive. Severus succeeded in his primary goal. He saved Rome from the immediate chaos of 193 CE by cutting away the illusion of civilian rule. But in building a state entirely dependent on military bribery and devalued coin, he planted the exact economic and political seeds that would tear the empire apart in the crisis of the 3rd century.